This is the video on the crash course for ecosystems, matter cycling, and energy flow. And this is going to cover Objective 3. Describe how the atoms that make up organisms in an ecosystem are constantly cycled between the living and non-living parts of an ecosystem. So you've probably heard of the water cycle and the rock cycle. But there are other types of cycles in ecosystems, and one is the carbon cycle, and another is the nitrogen cycle. Carbon and nitrogen are elements. You can go find them on the periodic table, and they are necessary for organisms on Earth to live. And so these are elements that you're going to find in both living and non-living things. And they can be broken down, they can be rearranged into new types of molecules that living things then use in order to survive. And so these molecules and these elements are constantly moving around and going from one place to another and being recycled over and over and over again. So first we're going to talk about the carbon cycle. Carbon is represented by the letter C. So in this example, in this picture, CO2, O is oxygen. CO2 is one carbon, two oxygen atoms that have bonded together. That makes a molecule of carbon dioxide. So carbon is found in lots of different things. It's obviously found in living organisms. It's found in lots of things you might be familiar with that are used for energy sources, oil, natural gas, coal, which all come from previously living organisms. And we can see it in the atmosphere. When we breathe out carbon dioxide. Plants use carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide is released in a process called combustion when we burn those fossil fuels. So lots of places we can find carbon. Just to kind of recap what we've already talked about, plants take in carbon dioxide from the air. They use it in photosynthesis to create glucose, sugar. So down here I've got that chemical formula for photosynthesis. There's that C, that carbon, in the carbon dioxide. After it goes through photosynthesis, that carbon is now found in that sugar molecule. So now there are 6 carbon atoms that have bonded with these hydrogen and oxygen atoms. Once animals, bacteria, fungi, and the plants themselves go through cellular respiration, they release some of that carbon into the environment. So down here is the formula for cellular respiration. So we start with glucose and oxygen. There's that carbon, those C atoms, goes through cellular respiration, and here they are back in the form of carbon dioxide, floating out into the atmosphere. Now, decomposers can also break down that carbon in dead animals and plants. So if the plant dies and goes into the soil, there's still going to be carbon trapped in some of those glucose molecules. So the decomposers will break those C's out and release those back into the atmosphere. The nitrogen cycle is essentially the same thing. Nitrogen is another element. It's represented by a capital letter N. Nitrogen, when it's floating around in the air, it can float with just another nitrogen atom bonded to it. So N2 means that those 2 nitrogen atoms are stuck together floating around. And that is also going to cycle from the atmosphere into living and non-living parts of the environment. This is a very detailed look at the nitrogen cycle. We're not going to get that detailed, but certainly feel free to look into this more if it's something that interests you. There is a pretty good video here. Again, if you go back to the slides version of this crash course, you can click the link, and this gives you a nice overview of the nitrogen cycle. The one thing you should know about the nitrogen cycle is it starts off often in the atmosphere. So remember those two nitrogen atoms that are stuck together, they're floating around as a gas. We cannot use nitrogen gas in this form. If you breathe in nitrogen gas, when you exhale, it will just exhale back out. Our lungs cannot convert that into what we need it. The same kind of goes for plants. Plants cannot just absorb it from the soil or from the air. We need to have kind of a helper there, and that's where bacteria come in. There are special bacteria in the soil that collect that gas that has made its way into the soil, and they transform it basically into another chemical called ammonium. So there's that N, the nitrogen, it's bonded with some hydrogen atoms. This ammonium is something that the plants can use. And so the plants will use this ammonium for different things that they need in order to survive. So the plants use the nitrogen after it's been fixed or changed by the bacteria. Plants use that nitrogen to create proteins for them to live, and then consumers eat those plants and use the nitrogen that exists within its cells. Or if you're a consumer, a secondary consumer, you will eat other consumers that have eaten the plants. So it's kind of like the energy pyramid where the further removed you are from the plant, the less you're getting in terms of nutrients. So once an animal or a plant dies, the nitrogen is broken down by the decomposers, goes back into the soil or the atmosphere, where it would then be fixed or changed by a bacteria later on in the process. A fun fact I forgot to mention, we'll go back to the carbon cycle. I mentioned that animals and plants that have once lived, when they die, they get further down into the layers of the rock and the soil, and eventually can possibly turn into fossil fuels like coal and oil. The cells that are broken down and those carbon molecules that are released back into that fossil fuel, those carbon atoms don't get destroyed, they just get locked away in that fossil fuel and then are released once we burn them or use them as fuel. Then those carbon atoms go into some plants for photosynthesis. Those plants are eaten perhaps by an animal, which then perhaps is eaten by you. So if we trace that carbon atom's path, let's trace it backwards. So we'll pretend like there's a human here. That human ate an animal. The animal ate the plant. The plant got the carbon from the atmosphere. That carbon got into the atmosphere through combustion. The coal that was used, that was burned, came from a deposit of coal. And that deposit of coal was created when a dinosaur died millions of years ago and was pressed down into the earth to become that fossil fuel. So, fun fact, you may have carbon atoms in you that were once in a dinosaur. And on that note, I will leave you.